So some of the big news right now is, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and that whole situation. And we're going to take some time to look back on the 20 years that they've been there, and whether there was a bunch of lies that were being told over the course of time, whether we even understand what the U.S.'s mission was. We're going to explore it. I got here with me David Helfrich. David, how you doing today? And what are we going to talk about?
Yeah, what's going on, Joe? It's good to be with you. This is obviously a provocative topic, so I'm looking forward to building with you on this.
Yeah. So let's talk right from the beginning here. We got the Taliban offering surrender right at the beginning of this war. Can you break that down?
Yeah, well, what's interesting about this is that if you go all the way back to 2001, after the United States first got involved in Afghanistan, the mission was to root out the Taliban, essentially, and to root out any vestige of Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, who was largely the face of 9/11 from the U.S. perspective. But just months after our involvement, as the B-52s were raining down on the Taliban at that time in November of 2001 went to then President Karzai of Afghanistan and said, "Look, we want to make a deal. The United States military power is just too much. We're losing too many lives." And at that point, Mullah Muhammad Omar of the Taliban, all he was asking for was amnesty. He just wanted to live the rest of his days out in Afghanistan in relative dignity. And at that time, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was like, "No, we're not inclined to negotiate your surrender. We don't want your surrender." They pretty much basically said, we have this bloodlust about 9/11. We want to go after you. We want to have this prolonged occupation. So as we fast forward to today, 20 years later, 2 decades later, we have spent $2 trillion. Thousands of servicemen and women have died. 250,000 approximately Afghan men and women, many of them civilians, have perished because of our involvement here. And we could have stopped this at its infancy in 2001 when the Taliban was keen to surrender. Instead, the Taliban became emboldened, martyrs were created, and their resolve was only more steadfast as the US occupation continued, which was the best recruiting horsepower they could have ever asked for the Taliban. So when we see how powerful the Taliban is today versus what could have happened in 2001 had the Bush administration simply stopped this in its infancy, makes us have to ask the question, what is our actual mission in Afghanistan? Why were we there for so long, particularly after the Taliban wanted to surrender, Osama bin Laden was killed? Why were we there for 20 years?
Yeah.
Sacrificing Afghan lives, sacrificing servicemen and women for what? Expending trillions of dollars from our treasury. And that's an answer that administrations, whether it's the Bush administration, Obama administration, Trump administration, now the Biden administration, hasn't really been clear on our mission. Now, to Biden's credit, he pulled out, and the withdrawal has been going poorly. Obviously, they didn't, really plan for all the contingencies and just the horrible way that this is unfolding. But the decision to get out was the correct decision in my estimation, because we had no mission there. Our mission was unclear, and we were just essentially becoming a military occupier in what was the longest war in the history of the United States.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that is, if the 9/11 narrative was in fact true, right, which there's a ton of questions on, you would think that, well, once you go and you beat up the bad guys, well, then, we're good. We can move on. But it was never about that. And I think that's part of the reason why the 9/11 narrative is so worthy of questioning, because what we're seeing here is most likely propaganda that's been given to the American people about a number of issues to convince them to stay in this war and to support this war. And yet the truth of it is probably something much different. And we see that again here in this 2010 leaked CIA document with regards to women's rights. Why don't we break that down a little bit?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point to bring up, Joe. So we know now from the WikiLeaks leaked CIA cable from 2010 that the United States was actually trying to sort of push this propaganda to some of our allies, namely in France and Germany, some of our NATO allies, to try to make the case to justify war by making a callous reference and really using women's rights as sort of this pawn to legitimize our continued occupation in Afghanistan. And of course, we see today that if you look on the media, everyone's talking about women's rights. George Bush is concerned about us withdrawing because of his purported concern for women's rights. But interestingly enough, I don't see him saying anything about women's rights in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else in the world. So the idea that we would sort of have this callous reference to women's rights without any real commitment to it and just use that as sort of a tool to keep us engaged and occupied in Afghanistan in perpetuity is really insane. And what that 2010 WikiLeaks cable shows is that there was this propaganda effort to maintain our presence there, even if it meant we were sort of making this disingenuous argument about preserving women's rights in Afghanistan. And of course, we have to ensure that women's rights are secured there and everywhere else in the world. But you don't do that solely through a military solution. Us having a military occupying presence in Afghanistan ultimately is not going to secure women's rights. Right. We need to exercise diplomacy and work with partners around the world to ensure that women's rights are respected and upheld there. So it was just really illuminating to see what arguments would be made to continue to justify U.S. presence there.
Yeah.
And of course, we know who benefited from this. The Pentagon's bloated defense budget, the stock prices of weapons manufacturers. I mean, if you invested $10,000 in Raytheon, for example, in 2001, that would be worth $100,000 today.
Yeah.
So clearly some people benefited, but I would argue that, the people of Afghanistan are likely in a worse place today because of our involvement, and the world and the region is in a worse place today because of our involvement there.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this is, you have, the immense loss of life. You have the whole, weapons industry profiting, all this sort of stuff. And a lot of this stuff is pretty clear to people, right? Like it's not like there's only a tiny portion of people that recognize that, the government is misleading people about what's happening within these wars. I mean, you have major journalists who have huge audiences talking about this stuff and who've been reporting on this forever. And, you start to see all that over the course of time. The government takes actions, they're obviously a lie, and then people lose trust. And so you start seeing this loss of trust in institutions that happens over and over again based on, the government's own actions. And, here them and their PR machines, aka the media, are pushing the idea that no, it's only conspiracy theorists that are making people lose trust in these institutions. And there's never this responsibility within government and within media themselves to say, hold on, we've been wrong, we've lied. There's so much evidence of us lying over and over and over and over again. Of course, people are going to lose trust in institutions, yet no responsibility taken. I mean, I feel like that's a huge part to this whole story where people are inevitably going to have to say, what the hell is the government doing and why?
Right. Yeah. And, in retrospect, Joe, it's an excellent point. In retrospect, there was only one person in the United States Congress who had that healthy skepticism of our involvement in Afghanistan. And that was Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who was the sole dissenting vote against us getting into Afghanistan and occupying Afghanistan in the aftermath of 9/11. So wanted to give her a shout out, obviously. But now I think you'll see in retrospect, a lot of people realize that our involvement in Afghanistan was not what it was purported to be at the onset. And they obviously utilized 9/11 and the trauma that was inflicted there and people in a sense of shock and trauma and pain from that to justify all of these military occupying endeavors in the Middle East, which, as we know now, have just wasted lives and money with really no return on the investment there.
Yeah, it's again, I'm almost left speechless to an extent, because the more we talk about this, the more it's just like, look, we have so much evidence over and over again of, governments taking advantage of crisis situations. I mean, we're seeing it with COVID, we see it with 9/11, we see it all these different things, and all of these situations are very shady. There's a lot of stuff going on where it's like we're not quite clear as to what actually happened or what is actually going on, which makes people wonder, is the concept of perhaps some knowledge of this, like we've talked about with Afghanistan. Apparently the intelligence communities in the US were well aware that the Afghan army was weak and that they wouldn't be able to do anything and this war was going to be lost and they were going nowhere, yet the public sentiment was, yeah, we're winning this, we're going to win this, there's no way we can lose. It's like you're directly lying to the public, right? And I don't know, I just keep coming back to that point because at some point people have to take responsibility for where their country is going, for where the world is going, and say, we're entrusting our trust, we're entrusting our faith in pathological liars. Like, I'm not trying to pick on them from a judgment point of view as much as I'm trying to say this is the racket, right? This is what's happening over and over and over again. And I think it's within the powers of the people to stop this. It's whatever the people continue to accept will continue to happen. I don't know. That's my feeling on this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, listen, each nation does have to exercise its own sovereign sense of self-determination. And, if you're going to get involved in a region as a superpower, you better be sure that 20 years later, you've secured a better reality and a better life for those people.
Yeah.
And it's just an abject failure and a tragedy that we can't say that about Afghanistan. We certainly can't say that about Iraq. So, for generations to come, these will be hard lessons learned. And unfortunately, it's been at the expense of too many lives in the Middle East.
Yeah. Well said. Well, once again, David, thanks so much for the reporting, insight, and wisdom on this. That's all.
For sure, Joe. You already know. It's good to be with you. Thank you.